product and roles are shifting. And Michael, I'd love to ask you first, and then Larry, about these shifting categories. And Michael, I've seen you talk about IT versus business dynamic, and MACH has gotten a lot of interest within the IT stakeholders out there. Microservices, API first, content oriented, and headless. So that MACH framework is something that's been a educational initiative, really well done, I think, by the MACH Alliance. And it's helped to shift some of the conversation and some of the product category conversations towards the service orientation we're talking about at the beginning. But it is ultimately like a technology-oriented shift. And I'm kind of curious about your reflections on the role that MACH has played and how do you see categories needing to evolve from here?
Yeah, I think this goes back to a point I made earlier about selling the value, and that I think people and enterprises are looking to find full solutions rather than pieces of functionality. And people who are developers are really thinking about the functionality and how they can manage that most effectively. So there's there's still a gap, I think, between how these, composability is being discussed and how people need to understand it. I don't think people in, say, the business side of things really understand the value of composability. I think there is value for them. They can choose the best tools to fit their needs. They're not really stuck with one, off-the-shelf product that's been designed in a certain way that's not meeting their needs. But they don't really have the ability always to assess what these tools do individually, much less how they work together. It's kind of a mystery to them, how that's all going to happen. But in terms of the shift in roles, I think there's a lot that can happen. I mean, I'm starting to see a lot more organizations really identify content operations as a very distinct role, as opposed to just having a content manager. So I think that's a really positive development. I think another thing that's happened in the past few years is you're seeing sort of this new role of what's sometimes called a market technologist, where they're expecting someone who is working in marketing to also have some interest in technology. So I think that's a good development as well. But we still, unfortunately, have a lot of people who support the business, but do so from the outside. So, even people in the UX team may not be embedded with the people who run the line of business, so we have this still distinction between the people who are responsible for profit and the people who are incurring expenses. And I think we need to separate that and get more collaboration by embedding people directly with different teams that they can, support.
That's a good bridge. Larry, can you reflect a little bit on that dynamic that Michael's talking about with technology shifting, but also the implied roles within the organization that are involved in these? Really, it's not content projects. These are customer experience delivery, initiatives that are foundational to everything an organization does, and the roles are shifting too.
I think a lot of this has to do with how people talk about stuff, how they label stuff. It's like a mondo meta information architecture problem that we need to talk better about what we're all doing and how we might fit together. And this kind of gets to Michael's points about, he hasn't used the words like this, not silo busting, but silo spanning kinds of things. I think, just figuring out a way to, if not get on the same page, at least have like a translator somewhere along the way who can help us understand and coordinate better. Because, and back to the personalization for just a minute, I've had the opportunity to see, like, at a pretty large scale, like huge content platform, like dozens, if not hundreds of engineers enriching media assets with all kinds of ML-driven metadata stuff. And then something like a CRM on the other side doing similar stuff to enhance customer data with affinities and preferences and on all the behavioral stuff we talked about, all the first-party data that you have about people. And the thing I haven't seen is just like a little tiny attempt to the orchestration role in the middle of like a little personalization unit or something. It's like a tenth the size of those other two units. Just to grossly oversimplify, you have content with an intent and a purpose over here. You have users with affinities and needs and desires over here. And you need a metadata strategy that stitches them together. And I don't see that metadata strategist ensconced as a role yet. I guess that's the biggest thing that's missing to me is like, who does that? Where does it sit in the org? It's And again, given our track record, I'm not optimistic we'll figure it out anytime soon.
Well, it's all part of these invisible functions that aren't clearly part of any one department's job. And that's why we believe that this idea that the content services organization needs to be budgeted, chartered, funded entity that is independent, that it's not on the side of somebody's plate. Content structure is not something that should be the side of one content strategist plate underneath the content design team inside of, buried 3D down, and all of a sudden there's this like little artifact running around in the SharePoint folder somewhere, which is the organization's taxonomy strategy or whatever, or there's the million spreadsheets running around, which is what we mostly see. So it's like there needs to be a chartered, funded set of people that care about these kinds of invisible things that make everybody else more potent and powerful.